Kristen Walsh didn't ask for his name. She didn't scan his boarding pass. She just looked Julian Carter up and down, black skin, calm posture, platinum ticket in hand, and tore it in half. "You're in the wrong section," she snapped, the words laced with casual cruelty. "Try economy or whatever seat people like you can actually afford." The first-class cabin froze. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. A man in 3B lowered his newspaper. A woman clutched her pearls, yet Julian, unshaken, bent down, picked up the shredded remains of his pass, and took his assigned seat 2A. He said nothing, but as he sat silent, composed, staring straight ahead, something irreversible had begun. Not in anger, but in strategy, in the quiet before a storm. Because Kristen Walsh had just insulted not only a man, but an empire. And in exactly 10 minutes, Julian Carter, the man she tried to erase with one rip of paper, would shut down her entire airline. Forever. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. The Apex Air Boeing 737 hadn't moved yet. The engine sat cold, the runway lights blinking idly outside the cabin windows at Miami International. Inside, the cabin's atmosphere thickened, charged not by turbulence but by tension. This was supposed to be a routine 10-minute systems check. But something far less mechanical was unfolding. Julian Carter, dressed in a charcoal Xenia blazer, sat in seat 2A like it had been etched for him. The torn boarding pass lay folded in his palm, edges frayed like nerves. Yet he didn't flinch. He didn't glance at the others. He stared forward as if none of it had happened, as if Kristen Walsh's contempt hadn't just been broadcast through every hush and whisper in first class. Kristen hovered by the aisle, arms folded. Her smirk lingered like perfume, the kind that poisons slowly. She leaned in close enough for Julian to hear her breath. "You think money buys everything," she muttered beneath her breath. "Some of us remember how your company pushed us out." Horizon Dynamics ring a bell. Julian blinked slowly. His voice, when it emerged, was smooth as water over stone. "You're referring to Vanguard Enterprises," he corrected. The subtle correction made her flinch. She didn't expect precision. She expected apology. Instead, she got clarity. But Julian Carter always knew who he was. He didn't need to raise his voice to prove it. 2 seats over in 2C, Diane Heller, a known private equity predator with champagne confidence, and predator eyes leaned in her pearls, gleaming like trophies. "You can switch with me, sweetheart," she said, gesturing to the rear. "You'd probably be more comfortable back there." Julian didn't look at her. He didn't need to. She wasn't offering kindness. She was offering erasure with a smile. Then, in a show of quiet retaliation, Kristen reached over and tapped Julian's seat panel. A dull beep sounded as she deactivated the recline. Another tap, and the call button dimmed. "Malfunctioning seat," she said aloud. "Safety first." The words floated through the cabin like a courtroom gavel. No one questioned it, but everyone heard it, especially the man in 3B, who slowly lowered his phone to begin recording. Row 4's passenger, a young documentary filmmaker named Noah Reed, lifted his phone and started filming Kristen's face. Julian's silence and Diane's scoffing grin. "Ma'am," he called out loud enough for all to hear, "are you disabling this man's seat because it's malfunctioning or because he's black?" Gasps. Shifts in posture. The mood shifted. Mia Jang, a travel influencer with a million-strong following, turned on her live stream. Her caption popped up instantly: "Apex Air exposed. Julian Gate." Kristen's face flushed. "Phones down," she snapped. "Or we'll call security." But even her voice shook. From coach, a figure stood. She moved slowly, deliberately toward the first-class lavatory, pausing only a second to meet Julian's eyes. No words, just a nod. It was Isabel Gomez, Vanguard's internal ethics officer, present, but unnoticed until now. Kristen, flustered, leaned over again. "Your ticket doesn't scan," she said flatly. "System shows it is void. You're not on this manifest." Julian reached into his blazer and calmly handed her a black platinum Apex Air card engraved with his initials. Kristen scoffed, glancing at it as if it were a napkin. "This doesn't mean anything," she said. That's when Evan Brooks stepped forward, dressed in subtle gray, carrying a Vanguard authorized badge and a tablet under one arm. Evan handed the device silently to Julian and stepped back. Kristen rolled her eyes, a complaint form. "How precious." Julian tapped 3 times. The tablet lit up. "This," he said, holding it up for her to see, "is my seat. My flight." He paused. "And my company." Silence erupted like a detonation. Diane leaned forward, her smirk dissolving. "Excuse me?" But before she could launch her next insult, a voice rang from the back. "I don't feel safe," shouted a red-faced man hurrying up the aisle and pointing at Julian. "He was arguing. He's being aggressive. I saw it." The lie was clumsy, obvious, but Kristen latched on fast. "Sir, we're handling this," she said, facing the crowd, not the liar. Julian raised his voice for the first time, but barely. "I've said fewer than 20 words since I boarded," he said. "But if you want to see what a real disruption looks like, give it 7 more minutes," Diane gasped. "Is that a threat?" Noah Reed's camera was already rolling. "Oh, it's about to get real," he whispered. In the lavatory, Isabel tapped her secure device, uploading Kristen's footage and Julian's manifest to Gregory Holt, chairman of the board, in 4 major newsrooms. The ethics alert was live. Kristen stood frozen. Evan leaned close to Julian. Chairman Holt is on a secure line. Isabel's uploaded everything. Tyler's tampering confirmed. Julian nodded once. "Stand by," he said. "Phase Sigma in 90 seconds. And somewhere in the sky, the system they thought was invincible started to crumble. A faint chime echoed through the cabin. Most passengers thought it was a routine seatbelt signal. It wasn't. Julian Carter sat in 2A, motionless. His gaze was calm, but his silence was loaded like a fuse waiting to reach the spark. Across from him, Kristen Walsh clutched her crew tablet tighter, fingers swiping through the manifest again and again, hoping to find an error that would save her from what she'd already set in motion. She didn't find one. "Mr. Carter's seat has been marked canceled," she repeated more to herself than anyone else. She turned the screen toward Tyler Quinn, the flight attendant standing nearby. Systems flagged it. Tyler, young and jittery, nodded without looking. "Yes, I see it. His seat isn't valid." But his words held no weight. Just weeks ago, Tyler had been overheard complaining in the break room about diversity hires and how Vanguard's acquisition would ruin the airline's culture. Now that same culture was folding in on itself. In seat 2C, Diane Heller crossed her legs and whispered, "Honestly, let's not drag this out. Some people just don't belong up here." Kristen didn't blink. She slipped her hand into her pocket where Diane had just placed a folded envelope. There was no hesitation, no second thought. She tucked it away like loose change. But what they didn't know, what none of them could see, was that Noah Reed's camera had caught it all. The envelope, the exchange, Kristen's grin, Diane's glint of superiority, and most importantly, Julian's unflinching stillness. From the economy cabin, Mia Jang's live stream ticked past 100,000 viewers. Her voice, steady and clear, spoke to the camera. "We just witnessed a bribe in first class. The target, a black CEO. The comments exploded. Julian Gate Apex fail. Modern Jim Crow silence. Is compliance back in the rear galley? Isabel Gomez, quiet ethics officer turned silent enforcer, sent 2 emails, one to Apex Air's crisis PR team and the second directly to Chairman Holt. Subject line: breach of federal ethics documentation attached. Evan Brooks, still by Julian's side, leaned in. "NBC just picked it up. Phase Sigma cleared." Julian gave the slightest nod. "Execute." Seconds later, the in-cabin Wi-Fi, usually spotty and reserved for premium passengers, surged. Tablets lit up. Notification banners slid across screens. Mia's stream hit 300,000 viewers. The hashtag "shut it down" climbed Twitter's top 5 globally. Kristen looked around. She felt a shift, but not its source. Her power, once propped up by assumption, was slipping digit by digit. Trying to salvage the moment, she forced a syrupy smile and leaned toward Julian. "Would you like some water while we, resolve this?" she said. Without waiting for his reply, she turned, filled a cup, and spilled it directly into his lap. Gasps, one or two muffled, "Oh my gods." A woman in row 5 covered her mouth. Mia's stream caught the splash in HD. Kristen feigned concern. "Oh, so sorry." Julian calmly took a napkin, wiped his hands, and placed it gently on the armrest. "This plane," he said softly, "has a leak far worse than that cup." Tyler stepped forward, more desperate than confident. "Security has been notified," he announced. "You may be asked to disembark." "On what grounds?" Evan asked, voice clear, camera now pointed at Tyler. "Boarding mismatch," Tyler replied. "System error. Happens all the time." Julian didn't move. "Interesting," he said. "Considering I built the system you're tampering with." From row 3A, a passenger finally spoke up. "This is harassment," another voice added. "I paid for my seat too, but nobody's tearing up my pass." A flight attendant off-duty began recording. Kristen's voice grew louder. "Everyone stay seated." "This is a minor issue." "It's not minor anymore," Noah said. "This is a reckoning." Suddenly from above, a screen began to lower from the ceiling. The projector, rarely used except for safety briefings, hummed to life. On screen, the Vanguard Enterprises logo appeared, followed by a live feed of Apex Air's boardroom. Julian remained still. A digital timer appeared in the corner, 4:59. Kristen stared. "What? What is this?" Julian replied without turning. "This is the shareholder meeting, and I'm the majority." Diane's jaw dropped. Tyler tried to shut the projector off. His screen blinked red. "Access revoked. Admin override Isabel G." In 2A, Julian Carter sat like a conductor as his orchestra of truth crescendoed around him. Kristen tried again. "You can't do this." Julian finally turned to her. "It's already done." Passengers stopped filming. They simply watched, mesmerized. A man who'd said barely a dozen words had just flipped the cabin into a courtroom and Apex Air into a defendant. He pressed one button. A new screen appeared. "Initiate grounding protocol." Confirm. The timer ticked down. The flight wasn't delayed. It was over. Julian Carter didn't stand up. He didn't need to. His silence had already landed louder than any announcement Apex Air had ever made. For 30 long seconds, the only sound inside Flight 227 was the low hum of the projector. A soft light bathed the first-class cabin, washing every leather seat, every overhead bin, and every stunned face in corporate white. The screen above displayed the Apex Air boardroom in real time. 12 suited executives appeared like ghosts, frozen in surprise, blinking into their webcams, faces taut with confusion. They hadn't expected a public session. They certainly hadn't expected it mid-flight, and none of them had anticipated that the majority shareholder, Julian Carter, would be live streaming the reckoning from seat 2A. Kristen Walsh's mouth opened, then closed. She looked around like a student who just realized the principal had been watching the entire time. This is a violation," she stammered. "No," Julian replied calmly, still seated. "This is accountability. You've mistaken silence for weakness. You won't do that again." Tyler Quinn stepped back, his fingers trembling above his tablet. He tapped at the screen, trying to shut down the feed, but every command returned the same red error. "Admin lock override engaged." From the economy cabin, Isabel Gomez leaned back in her seat and crossed her arms, satisfied. She hadn't raised her voice once. She didn't need to. Her fingerprints were on every override, every data stream, every breadcrumb trail that now led back to Kristen, Tyler, and Apex itself. Up front, Julian's assistant, Evan Brooks, held out his tablet once more. The display showed live reactions flooding in from global investors, ethics, watchdogs, and civil rights organizations. Chairman Gregory Holt's profile flickered on screen, his face grave. "This is Gregory Holt," came his voice through the overhead cabin audio. As chairman of the board, I am authorizing an emergency review of Apex Air's leadership team. This is no longer an internal matter, it is a shareholder crisis. Passengers gasped. Phones were lifted again. No one dared to whisper now. Kristen's knees buckled slightly as she grabbed the nearest seat for balance. Diane Heller, who had remained smug and aloof, now shifted in her seat, pulling her designer scarf tighter around her neck. She muttered something under her breath, but no one cared to listen. The woman who'd smirked and bribed her way through injustice was now squirming beneath the very structure she thought she controlled. Julian stood not with a flourish, not with a command, but with the deliberate grace of a man who knew exactly when to rise. He turned to face the cabin. "My name," he said, "is Julian Carter. I am the CEO of Vanguard Enterprises. As of this quarter, I own 51% of Apex Air Holdings." No applause followed, only stunned silence. And then slowly something else respect. He continued. "This seat 2A was purchased with my name, my credentials, my verified payment. But the moment I boarded this aircraft, that didn't matter. Because to some of you, I was just another black man who didn't belong." He scanned the room. Kristen lowered her eyes. Tyler slumped further into his jump seat. Diane remained stiff eyes forward, as if hoping stillness would render her invisible. Julian pressed another button on Evan's tablet. The screen above split in two. On the left, a timeline of in-flight events, each time stamped: boarding pass, torn seat, disabled. Water dumped. On the right, the federal regulations regarding passenger profiling, tampering, and data manipulation. Next to Kristen's name appeared three strikes. "Kristen Walsh," Julian said, his tone even. "You tore up a valid boarding pass. You lied about a system error. You accepted a bribe." All within 8 minutes. Kristen opened her mouth, but Julian held up a hand. "No excuses. You had a choice, and you made the wrong one." Tyler flinched when his name was next. "Tyler Quinn, you manipulated passenger data on a federally regulated flight. That's not just unethical. That's criminal." Across the aisle, Diane scoffed. "Oh, give me a break. Are you seriously turning this plane into a courtroom?" Julian didn't look at her. "No, Ms. Healer. You did that the moment you treated your privileges policy." He tapped once more. The overhead screen now displayed a live shareholder vote. "Terminate flight 2027, staff for cause. Voters 713, all in favor." A green check mark flashed next to each name. Kristen stepped backwards, stunned. You can't fire me from here." Julian met her gaze. "I already did." Diane stood abruptly. "This is absurd. This is revenge." Julian looked at her for the first time. "No, this is precedent, so that no one ever has to prove they belong again." A pause long and waited. Then the intercom cracked again. "This is Apex Air Command. Effective immediately, Kristen Walsh and Tyler Quinn are relieved of duty. All access revoked. Do not engage with passengers. Disembark upon arrival." Gasps. Tyler buried his face in his hands. Kristen's lips quivered. Her voice lost in the gravity of consequences she never expected to face. Julian sat down again. But the message had already stood tall. Silence is not weakness, it's strategy. And justice doesn't need permission. It only needs evidence. And now justice had taken the pilot's seat. As Julian sat back in seat 2A, the energy in the cabin shifted again, this time from disbelief to reckoning. The passengers who once watched in silence now leaned forward. Eyes once diverted, now locked on his every move. And yet Julian wasn't gloating. He wasn't even smiling. His silence remained his sharpest weapon. From the back galley, Isabel Gomez's encrypted signal reached its final destination, the Federal Aviation Administration's Discrimination Response Unit. The upload pinged across secure terminals in Washington, D.C., flagged with a Level 1 classification civil rights emergency on board a commercial aircraft. The footage, the logs, the vote, every bite of injustice was now federal evidence. On the Apex boardroom screen above the aisle, Chairman Gregory Holt cleared his throat. Ladies and gentlemen, as of 3:16 p.m. EST, Mr. Carter has exercised his majority shareholder authority to initiate full operational pause of Apex Air Services, effective immediately. A murmur spread from row to row. Tyler looked like he'd aged a decade in 10 minutes. Kristen, stripped of her badge and command, stood rooted in place. Her lips pressed tightly together, arms wrapped around her chest, as if bracing for a storm she never saw coming. The projector flickered again, this time displaying Apex's flight grid. Red bars began appearing next to dozens of flight numbers across the globe. JFK to LAX canceled. O'Hare to Dulles delayed. Heathrow to Atlanta grounded. Julian turned slightly to Evan. Status update. Evan didn't look up. 37 flights delayed. 19 already grounded. Over 100 media outlets reporting. Social traffic approaching 6 million impressions. FAA is monitoring. No interference so far. Good, Julian said simply. In the cabin, a small ripple of sound rose. One man clapped just once, then another. Not loud, not celebratory. It was the kind of applause you give when someone says something you didn't know needed saying until they said it out loud. Julian looked forward unmoved. He wasn't doing this for the applause. He was doing it to make sure no one else had to go through what he just did. Dignity shattered not by slurs or screams, but by calculated silence and bureaucratic bias. A ding interrupted the silence. The cockpit door cracked open and Captain Elena Monroe stepped out. A veteran pilot with 2 decades of flight hours in a crisp Navy uniform, she had been watching the entire ordeal from her command seat. Her face was unreadable, but her words carried weight. Mr. Carter, she said, as captain of this flight, I request your guidance on how to proceed. Julian met her eyes. Respect, that's all he needed. Hold position at gate. No movement until phase sigma is complete. Yes, sir, she said, then glanced at Kristen, who now looked visibly smaller under her once pristine blazer. Captain Monroe turned on her heel and returned to the cockpit. There was no argument, no rebuttal. Across the aisle, Mia Jang whispered into her live stream. For the first time ever, a black CEO grounded a plane, not because he was disruptive, but because the system was. In the rear cabin, passengers exchanged glances, then turned their attention forward. They weren't sure what was coming next, but they knew this was more than just a corporate power play. It was something historic, something righteous. Julian lifted his tablet again. A final screen appeared: Project Air Vigil, live launch confirmation pending. His thumb hovered over the confirmation icon, the digital equivalent of a gavel drop. Let the world see it, he whispered. Evan gave a subtle nod. All feeds secure, privacy protections in place. Julian tapped the screen. Across the internet, an explosion of headlines appeared. Breaking Vanguard launches, Air Vigil, AI-powered oversight platform to combat airline discrimination in real time. Apex under review fleet shutdown, confirmed by CEO Julian Carter. Justice in the sky black. UEO exposes discrimination mid-flight grounds, entire airline. Inside the aircraft, every screen, every phone buzzed with the news. Even flight attendants from economy peeked around the curtain to watch, unsure whether to cheer or retreat. Kristen tried one final time. You're making a spectacle. Julian glanced at her. No, he said, calm as ever. You did that when you tore up my ticket. A low beep echoed through the intercom, a signal Julian had been waiting for. Isabel's voice filled the cabin once more. Apex Air Systems confirmed in full compliance with Vanguard shareholder override. FAA acknowledges grounding, all commands final. Tyler slumped further. Kristen sat down. Diane clutched her bag and said nothing. Julian leaned back in his seat, the cabin vibrating with silence, not fear, but reverence. He had never raised his voice, never demanded a thing, and yet his quiet resolve had achieved what so many thought impossible. He hadn't just silenced prejudice, he'd replaced it with policy. From seat 2A, justice took flight. While the cabin processed the magnitude of what had just unfolded, Julian Carter remained composed, his posture as deliberate as the systems he just exposed. Around him, passengers whispered with widened eyes, trying to reconcile the man they just watched ground an entire airline with the one who'd entered the aircraft in quiet dignity only moments before. But for Julian, this was no spontaneous outburst. It was the culmination of years of systemic disregard disguised as customer protocol. Every smile that tightened at the sight of his face, every gate agent that double-checked his ID, every random screening, and now every suppressed boarding pass, every seat cancellation masked as a glitch. He had kept records of it all, quietly, methodically. Evan leaned across the aisle and whispered, "Press is asking for a statement. CNBC and Bloomberg both. Legal says they'll hold off publishing if we give them a quote before the hour ends." Julian shook his head. Let the silence speak first. In the cockpit, Captain Monroe monitored the secure line from Apex Air Operations. Her headset crackled. "Captain, this is Control. Confirm suspension directive. Do not initiate pushback. Repeat, hold at gate. Corporate override verified." She tapped the control panel twice and muttered under her breath, "Well, that's a first." Back in first class, the screen above the aisle now displayed a growing social trend map. Julian Carter Apex Accountability Power. In silence, all trending worldwide. A video compilation automatically generated by Vanguard's Media Sync algorithm began cycling through the incident's key moments. The torn ticket, the bribe, the water spill, and finally Julian's calm stare into the camera. But the video didn't stop there. It cut to footage from earlier flights. Some of them internal records previously buried, a black teenager being asked to prove he belonged in business class, a disabled veteran having a seat moved to economy due to overbooking, a South Asian woman separated from her children and seated randomly for balance. All collected, all time-stamped, all attached to the same names: Kristen Walsh, Tyler Quinn, Diane Heller. Passengers gasped as they saw it. This wasn't a one-off, it was a pattern, a loop of bias woven deep into the airline's cultural code. Julian exhaled softly, his eyes fixed on the footage. He wasn't angry, not visibly, but inside something was burning, not rage but resolve. A soft chime rang out again. A message displayed across every passenger's tablet screen. To all Apex Air passengers, due to confirmed violations of federal civil rights policy, this aircraft is being held under emergency protocol until oversight teams arrive on site. We apologize for the delay and thank you for your patience as corrective measures are enforced. Corrective measures, Mia whispered. That's what they call justice now. In the rear galley, Kristen leaned forward, elbows on knees, hands trembling. Her once pristine uniform now felt like a costume. She stared at her name on the termination screen, blinking, hoping it would disappear. It didn't. Tyler slumped beside her, mumbling to himself. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. It was supposed to be nothing, but it was never nothing, not to the people on the receiving end." Diane stayed silent, the reality crashing into her posture. She clutched her designer bag like a shield, but it couldn't protect her from the fact that she'd just become the face of institutional entitlement. Her name, once reserved for boards and invitations, would now be cited in corporate ethics handbooks under what not to do. Julian finally stood, not for applause, not for revenge, but because there were moments in life when standing wasn't optional, it was necessary. He walked toward the front of the cabin with slow, unhurried steps. The projector screen followed him like a spotlight. When he reached the curtain separating the galley from the rest of the plane, he paused, then turned back to the passengers. "I want to say something," he said, his voice low but resonant. The cabin fell completely silent. This wasn't about a seat, he began. It was about the quiet ways people get told they don't belong. Ways that are polite, procedural, professional, but never neutral. He looked directly at Kristen, then at Tyler, then toward Diane. For years, this airline, like many others, has used policy to excuse bias, technology to mask prejudice, silence to protect misconduct. But today, that ends. Not because I raised my voice, but because I refused to bow my head. The passengers didn't cheer. They didn't need to. They listened. This moment isn't about me. It's about every traveler who ever felt smaller the second they walked on board. Every professional who got asked twice for ID while someone else sailed past. Every name misspelled, every seat reassigned, every voice ignored. He paused, scanning the cabin. I'm not shutting down Apex Air to destroy it. I'm grounding it to rebuild it, so that when it flies again, it does so with integrity, not excuses. A long beat, then a quiet voice from the back from a teenage boy in economy. Thank you. Julian turned toward him and nodded. Then he sat down again. And just like that, the sky began to change. As Julian settled back into seat 2A, the first-class cabin remained frozen in a kind of reverent silence. No one moved. No one spoke. It was the kind of silence that doesn't happen after a delay or even an announcement, but after a shift. A fundamental, irreversible shift. But that silence didn't last long. A ripple of activity began on the ground. At Miami International's Terminal D, departure monitors began blinking lines of text refreshing in stuttered waves. Apex Air 762 delayed. Apex Air 341 canceled. Apex Air 227 held at gate by order of board. In the operations center, voices overlapped in frantic urgency. Who authorized this? One supervisor barked. Julian Carter, a tech, replied grimly. The system's locked under Vanguard's executive override. He can't do that. He already did. Meanwhile, at Apex Air's New York headquarters, inside a conference room shielded by floor-to-ceiling glass, attention executives hunched over screens displaying real-time cancellations, rerouted flights, and cascading revenue loss predictions. The numbers weren't just dipping, they were hemorrhaging. A PR director ran into the room breathless. CNN just ran a banner, CEO grounds airline over racial profiling. We're live on 6 networks. No one responded. There was nothing to say. Back on Flight 227, Julian sat with his hands folded, watching passengers receive the headlines on their tablets. One by one, the cabin became a sea of glowing screens, all confirming what many still couldn't believe. The man in 2A had just taken down an entire airline without shouting, without threats, without raising his pulse. Tyler Quinn slouched in the crew jump seat, stared at his blank tablet. Kristen sat beside him, eyes hollow. For all their coordination, all their assumptions, none of their protocol had prepared them for this. The cockpit door opened. Captain Monroe stepped out slowly, her expression unreadable. She walked down the aisle to Julian's seat. Mr. Carter, she said quietly, we've just received confirmation. Apex's board has ceased all outbound operations for the next 48 hours. Julian nodded once. Good. That'll be enough time to clean house, she hesitated. My crew's scared. Julian looked up. So was I. That was all he said. Captain Monroe stood there for another beat, then turned and walked back toward the cockpit. Her crew watched her closely. In her eyes, they saw something shift, not fear, not resentment, but reflection. No one was immune anymore. The curtain had been pulled back. Behind Julian, Noah Reed, still filming, whispered to his camera, we're not on a plane. We're in the middle of a revolution. And the general, he's seated quietly in 2A. At Apex's crisis response room, the phones rang without pause. Government transportation officials were on the line. So were airline unions, major investors, and civil rights lawyers. But the call everyone in the room dreaded finally came through a request from the House Transportation Subcommittee on Oversight and Reform. The voice on the other end was clear. We need to understand what led to this, who allowed it, and what Apex intends to do next before we decide what to do about Apex. Meanwhile, Julian's device vibrated once on his tray table. A single message: Air Vigil registrations have surpassed 4 million. DOJ, Has scheduled preliminary inquiry. He tapped once to acknowledge. Evan leaned across the aisle. That was fast. Julian's reply was quiet. Truth travels fast when you stop chasing approval. On the other side of the plane, Mia Jang wiped her eyes. My father was removed from a flight in 2002. No video, no protest. He never flew again. If he were alive, I'd want him to see this. From the rear of the aircraft, a flight attendant named Celeste approached Julian cautiously. She had watched everything unfold from jump seat, three lips pressed tight, heart pounding. She had been one of the few who hadn't moved a muscle during Kristen's spectacle, hadn't supported it, but hadn't stopped it either. Mr. Carter, she said softly. He looked up. I didn't know what to say, but I saw it all, and I'm sorry I didn't speak up. Julian regarded her for a long moment, then said, what matters is what you say next time. Just make sure there's a next time. Celeste nodded, her throat tight, then stepped back. Behind her, other passengers turned, listening, absorbing. It wasn't just a lesson, it was a mandate. The curtain of pretense had burned down. Across the nation, in lounges, terminals, and gate waiting areas, people watched the footage play again and again. The torn ticket, the spilled water, the bribe, and the moment Julian pressed the shutdown button. Some cheered, some stared in silence. Others simply nodded as if confirming a truth they had always known, but had never seen confirmed in such undeniable clarity. Kristen finally spoke. Her voice was brittle. You planned this. Julian turned slightly, not out of hostility, but revelation. No, he said, you did. I just gave it the stage. By the time the plane was fully surrounded on the Miami tarmac with floodlights washing the fuselage in pale white and ground staff whispering into headsets, Julian Carter remained immovable in seat 2A, calm, dignified, and entirely in control. But beneath that stillness, wheels were turning. Evan leaned in beside him and whispered, FAA has acknowledged fleet compliance. Full grounding confirmed. They're expecting you to issue a public statement in the next hour. Julian didn't answer immediately. His eyes moved instead, tracking the ripples. The middle-aged couple in row 3, who had first looked uneasy, now sat stone-faced watching. The off-duty attendant in row 5 had lowered her phone, finally registering the gravity of what she'd recorded. Kristen Walsh, once defiant and venomous, was visibly shrinking into the crew seat near the galley, her badge no longer a symbol of authority, but of exposure. And Diane, the woman who had whispered racialized elitism with the elegance of a country club lunch, she was slowly spiraling, scrolling through her phone and failing to find any signal, any leverage left. But Julian wasn't watching them for revenge. He was watching to see if they understood. A small ding sounded from his encrypted tablet. The Vanguard intranet flashed to life. It was time. He reached beneath his seat and lifted the briefcase Kristen had so eagerly dropped into his lap. It was old, weather-worn Italian leather with a faint scratch running across the right buckle. The kind of scratch you only keep on something that's gone through a war with you. Inside wasn't just paperwork or electronics. It was history. Julian opened the briefcase, slowly revealing a set of old files, one labeled Board Obstruction 2019, another titled Suspicious Manifest Overrides 2021. He paused on a folder marked simply the Kristen file. Inside, documentation dates recordings in 3 formal complaints filed by passengers over the past 5 years, all dismissed, all routed through Tyler Quinn's digital access, all marked insufficient evidence. Julian handed them silently to Evan. Send it to DOJ and FAA Ethics, he said, and archive the originals. Yes, sir, but that wasn't the end of the contents. Julian reached into a false bottom panel and withdrew something that didn't belong in any corporate briefcase. A silver fountain pen engraved with the initials JMC, Julian Michael Carter. It had once belonged to his father, a postal worker who never made more than $47,000 a year, but taught him the value of precision, of writing things down, of keeping records, even when no one else cared. Julian placed the pen carefully on the tray in front of him. He then opened a small leather-bound notebook, handwritten in blue ink, line by line, date by date. Every racist interaction he'd endured while building Vanguard from nothing. Every time he was asked if he was in the wrong room or told executive dining is upstairs. Every instance, someone like Kristen thought they could define his worth by skin or silence. Julian had never shared it with anyone. Until now. He handed the notebook to Evan. "I want this digitized," he said. "Let the world see the road that brought us here." Evan blinked. All of it," Julian confirmed. "No edits, no softening, just the truth." Meanwhile, the projector overhead came back to life. Isabel, operating from economy, had loaded a new file, a digital timeline stretching back 18 months, mapping Apex Air's internal complaints. It showed spikes every quarter, primarily centered on two airports, Miami and Denver. The data didn't just prove bias, it exposed a culture, one that was systematic, protected, and profitable until now. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian said aloud, rising from his seat again. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut clean through the cabin's murmur. "I won't insult you with platitudes. You saw what happened here. You felt it. And now you know it wasn't the first time." He held up the notebook. "This is every time I said nothing." He let the silence sink in before continuing. "But today I chose different." The screen behind him flashed again. A new file appeared, Vanguard Remediation Framework. Julian explained. "Starting today, Apex Air will undergo a 120-day mandatory operational audit. All staff will be retrained under a joint ethics and compliance board. Every passenger complaint filed since 2020 will be reopened and reevaluated. All outcomes will be published." The cabin was silent. Mia's eyes glistened again, her hand covering her mouth. Julian continued. "Every mile you've flown with Apex has built this company. You deserve better. So from this moment forward, we build something better. Not for PR, not for profit, for truth." The applause didn't start all at once. It began as a few hands in row 4. Then others joined. No roaring cheers, no chants. Just the kind of clapping that comes from people witnessing something rare: accountability without deflection, leadership without noise. Julian nodded once and sat back down, the pen and notebook still on his tray. Kristen sat unmoving, pale and hollow. For the first time in her career, she was speechless. Diane turned to the window. Tyler looked down at his shoes like they held the answers. But no one said a word. The man they tried to silence had just delivered their sentence. Without rage, without force, just with truth. The cabin of Flight 227 was no longer a passenger compartment. It had become a courtroom, a boardroom, and a broadcast studio all at once. Outside, the airport buzzed with confusion as Apex Air's systems went into full lockdown. Screens across terminals read the same 4 chilling words: "Fleet suspended until further notice." Back inside, the silence surrounding Julian Carter was no longer discomfort, it was reverence. Passengers had put their phones away, not because they weren't interested, but because they didn't want to interrupt the gravity of what was happening. Some sat with folded hands. Others leaned forward, watching every breath Julian took like it was the next chapter in a book they couldn't stop reading. Evan approached with the latest update. "FAA has issued a provisional review order. We've got an opening if you want to go public." Julian shook his head slowly. "Not yet. Let them catch up to the truth before we tell it again." In the rear, Kristen tried to stand. Her legs wobbled, her voice thin. "This isn't fair," she said, aiming her words not at Julian but at the passengers. "I was just doing my job." But the passengers weren't looking at her anymore. She lost their gaze the moment she tore that boarding pass. "I followed protocol," she added louder now. "I followed procedure." That word procedure echoed like a curse. Julian turned his head slowly, meeting her eyes. "That's the problem," he said evenly. "Your procedure was designed to fail people like me. Quietly, repeatedly, and without consequence." She opened her mouth again, but said nothing. The weight of it all, the footage, The documentation, the global reaction was finally cracking her armor. Behind her, Diane finally stood up wobbling in her Louboutin heels. She adjusted her scarf, gathering what pride she had left. "You may think you've won," she said icily, "but this isn't over. People like me don't disappear." Julian tilted his head slightly. "People like you never do," he said, "but systems built to protect you, those are crumbling by the second." Just then a soft chime rang out from the overhead console. The screen refreshed. Security Footage Compilation Exhibit B. The title faded into a set of videos from different flights, all involving Kristen Walsh and Tyler Quinn. Different planes, different passengers. The same pattern: boarding pass glitches, downgraded seats, staff whispers caught on camera, and a striking number of targeted individuals, all people of color, the elderly or otherwise out of place. In one clip, Kristen turned to a coworker and muttered, "She's not a priority flyer. She just dresses like one." In another, Tyler manually altered seating assignments before boarding. The final clip showed both of them laughing in a break room, watching a passenger get denied a seat. Kristen covered her mouth. Diane sat back down, lips tight. Tyler began to cry. The passengers of Flight 227 had seen enough. A woman in row 3, a retired judge from Boston, stood. "Mr. Carter," she said firmly, "you have every right to proceed." Julian looked at her and gave a small nod. Then he stood once more. "This airline's problem was never its aircraft," he began. "It wasn't the food, the delays, or even the cost. It was culture. A culture that rewards the quiet insult, defends the casual dismissal, and silences dissent with policy. But cultures can be rebuilt. That's what today marks." The screen changed again. This time it displayed a new title: the Apex Initiative, Clean Skies. Clean systems. Julian spoke with purpose. Effective immediately, Apex Air will undergo a full systemic audit. All employees will be retrained under a new ethics certification. A third-party compliance firm, independent from all existing vendors, will oversee every passenger interaction for the next 12 months. A new ombudsman office led by Isabel Gomez will report directly to shareholders. A wave of disbelief ran through the cabin. Additionally, he continued, "We are opening every personnel file flagged for behavioral complaints. Starting with this flight crew." He turned to Kristen, then Tyler. "If you believe your record protects you, now would be a good time to check again, because silence is no longer protection." Kristen sat her hands clenching the jump seat handles like lifelines. Julian turned back to the passengers. "We've spent too long assuming injustice only counts when it's shouted. But injustice whispered is still injustice. And in my company, it ends today." Another chime. This time the intercom buzzed to life. "Mr. Carter," the pilot said over the speaker, his voice steady but deferential. "Miami Control has cleared us to return to the gate. We're initiating taxi sequence." Julian nodded. "Proceed." He turned back to Evan. "Release the press statement. All of it. Name names. Show faces. Let the world see exactly who thought first class was a private club." "Yes, sir." Julian took his seat again, fingers laced. He'd come aboard quietly, platinum pass in hand like any other flyer. He'd been humiliated, undermined, and soaked with water meant to symbolically erase him. But now he was writing the airline's future with the same calm silence they thought meant submission. The sky might be limitless, but even it wasn't big enough to contain this reckoning. The plane rolled slowly back toward the terminal, but this was no routine taxi. There were no flight attendants smiling, no announcements about tray tables or overhead bins. No turbulence in the sky, but the cabin had just weathered a storm of its own making. The passengers sat in a strange hush. It wasn't discomfort, it was awakening. Julian Carter, seated in 2A, once more reached for his handkerchief and quietly dried the remaining water from his lap. It had dried mostly, but the message behind it lingered like a stain. He placed the napkin beside him on the tray, neat, folded, and forgotten by no one. Across the aisle, Diane Hiller had withdrawn into herself. Her phone lay dark on her lap, her fingers twitching, but never unlocking the screen. Her world, once composed of spreadsheets, leveraged investments, and tightly held privileges, had narrowed to this row, this moment, this reckoning. She had underestimated a man she believed was just passing through. Behind them, Kristen sat still. The audio clip of her staff meeting the one where she openly judged passengers before even greeting them played again in her head. The laughter from off-screen now sounded like knives. She had known she was being petty when she tore Julian's boarding pass. What she hadn't known, what none of them had known, was who exactly they were challenging. Tyler Quinn didn't even pretend to scroll through his dead tablet anymore. His fingers were frozen. His career wasn't just over. It was now an exhibit, an example in a larger case study about digital manipulation and embedded bias. The shame, once easy to disguise in procedural jargon, now stared him in the face from 3 separate screens overhead. Julian opened his tablet. A new message had arrived. Subject confirmed SEC, observers, request statement, FAA coordinating compliance officers. He tapped twice and locked the screen. It was moving faster than he anticipated. But then again, truth often does once unshackled. From the rear cabin, Isabel walked forward with a printout in hand. She passed Tyler without looking at him and approached Julian. "Sir," she said, handing him the document, "the initial FAA violation report draft. We've included the manipulated seating logs, the manual override timestamps, in Kristen's recorded statements." He accepted it quietly. Behind them, passengers watched not with suspicion, but with approval. Some even nodded. He was still silent, but his silence wasn't absence. It was precision. The quiet deliberation of a man who had watched the system bend too many times around people like Kristen Tyler and Diane and finally chose not to wait for another apology. Evan stepped into the aisle. He had something in his hand now, a flight crew badge. Not his, Kristen's. He had retrieved it when the system formally revoked her access. He placed it gently in the empty beverage cart beside the jump seat where Kristen now sat. She didn't look up. The badge's plastic casing clicked softly against the metal tray. That was the only sound. Then the door beside her opened. 2 uniformed security officers from Miami International Airport stepped on board, calm but purposeful. They approached Kristen and Tyler holding printed instructions, orders directly from Apex Air's board, and endorsed by Vanguard's legal team. Tyler stood without resistance. Kristen, to her credit, didn't cry, but her hands trembled as she unpinned her name tag. One officer gestured toward Diane. She started to protest, but her words caught in her throat. No amount of legacy status could outrun the footage. The passengers had already seen her offer the bribe, heard her disdain, and watched her try to minimize it all under the banner of wealth and decorum. When the trio passed Julian's row, he didn't look at them. He didn't need to. His eyes were on the runway outside, watching ground crews scurry in confusion as command terminals flashed red, halted by his override. This wasn't just a public relations disaster, it was a shutdown of assumptions. The expectation that nothing would come from a moment of humiliation. The belief that men like him could be denied quietly and without recourse. The intercom buzzed. "Ladies and gentlemen," the pilot said, his voice measured and neutral, "we have been instructed to remain parked at the gate for an extended review process. Please stay seated until further notice." Passengers didn't complain. They didn't grumble. They knew something far greater than takeoff schedules was happening. Julian opened his briefcase. Inside wasn't paperwork, but the beginnings of something new, a proposal titled The Passenger Bill of Integrity, a living document, a binding set of standards for fairness, transparency, and digital accountability in air travel. He had drafted the outline a year ago, unsure if it would ever see the light of day. Now he knew it would fly. He removed a pen and uncapped it and began revising section headers. His fingers moved with calm intent, silent yes, but never passive. Every stroke was a promise. That dignity wasn't optional. That respect was non-negotiable. That next time the only thing passengers would need to prove was that they had a seat. Julian Carter didn't flinch when the heavy doors of Flight 227 swung open again. He remained seated in 2A head, tilted slightly, watching the rows ahead of him shift with subtle movements. One passenger pulled out his phone to reread the news headline. Another adjusted her scarf, her eyes lingering on Julian with something like admiration. No one stood up. No one dared to leave. Not yet. Outside under the terminal's tungsten floodlights, ground crew teams scrambled, eyes flicking between handheld tablets and red blinking alerts that made no sense. The message repeated Apex Air operations suspended pending shareholder review. Inside the cabin, silence hung in the air, not heavy but expectant. Julian finally stood. He moved with the same deliberateness he always had. Quiet, steady, as though nothing that had happened had surprised him. As if this every frame, every confrontation, every flicker of system collapse had been waiting for the exact moment to occur. He stepped past seat 2B and gently placed a folded napkin over the water stain that still lingered faintly on the cushion. It wasn't about cleaning, it was about clarity. Even a seat soaked in insult could be restored with intention. As he moved down the aisle, the passengers shifted, making space. Some nodded, some touched their hearts. None of them recorded him. It wasn't about the footage anymore. It was about witnessing something real, unmistakable, measured, permanent. At the galley, Isabel handed him a slim folder. Media requests are coming in from every angle, she said quietly, but we're not responding until legal clears the rollout. Julian nodded. Let the silence speak louder than their microphones. She paused. The Secretary of Transportation's office wants to speak. Tonight, they're suggesting Vanguard lead a joint ethics task force. He gave her a look that was both tired and resolute. One problem at a time. Right now, we need to finish the internal audit, the real one, with names, incidents, digital trails, not just for Apex, but for every vendor connected to this ecosystem. She glanced toward the terminal glass where shadows were moving behind the windows. Cameras, flashing lights, microphones rising like antennae from a crowd that was hungry not just for a story, but for accountability. Evan joined them near the exit. The AI flagged a second wave of manipulation attempts in the Eastern Fleet servers, he reported. Miami and JFK both. Nothing critical, but patterns matched Tyler's behavior. Julian's jaw tightened. Make a list, map it, every tampered manifest, every overwritten profile. If they thought the first purge was serious, they haven't seen reform yet. Evan nodded. And what about the customer trust panel? We build it with real people, regular flyers, nurses, teachers, disabled travelers. We don't just rebuild the airline, we democratize oversight. Just then the gate door clicked open again, and two representatives from the FAA stepped in dressed in navy jackets with gold trim and official credentials. One of them, a short gray-haired woman with a hawk-like stare, walked directly to Julian. Mr. Carter, she said, her tone formal, but not cold. We've reviewed the submitted files, the tampering logs, the video footage, the boardroom override. You followed protocol, if unconventionally. Sometimes, Julian replied, justice has to catch a red eye. She gave a dry chuckle. We'll begin issuing compliance alerts to other carriers first thing tomorrow. Your actions may have just redefined enforcement. Julian tilted his head. Good. Let's make accountability contagious. The agent extended her hand not as an officer of the agency, but as someone who understood what she had just witnessed. Thank you for not walking away when you could have. He shook it. With that, the agents exited, leaving behind a corridor of stunned silence. Julian turned back toward the passengers. Many were now standing in the aisle, waiting not to leave, but to follow. Not literally, but ideologically. They had seen what happens when power isn't loud, but strategic. Not emotional, but exact. A woman near the exit reached out and touched Julian's sleeve. I've flown 147 times for work, she whispered. I've been ignored, delayed, talked over. But today, Today, someone actually won. Julian didn't respond with words. He simply gave a short nod. Respect didn't need applause. He finally exited the plane flanked by Evan and Isabel, walking into a terminal bristling with attention. But he didn't stop. He didn't smile for cameras. He didn't wave. He walked toward the future like it belonged to him because it did. Not because of his wealth, not because of revenge, but because he had proven something systems never expect from their most quietly excluded passengers. That when dignity is denied, silence isn't surrender. It's strategy. And when the silence ends, everything begins again. Inside the executive hangar of Vanguard Aviation's private terminal, a quiet war room had sprung to life. The air was cooler here, scrubbed clean by industrial filtration systems and humming servers. But the tension buzzed hotter than ever. On the central screen, a real-time heat map pulsed in red and gold, each dot representing a grounded Apex air flight. The boardroom of Apex had crashed, but this wasn't the end. This was the audit. Julian Carter stepped into the center of it all, his briefcase still damp from the flight placed gently on the chrome conference table. Isabel opened it like a sacred vault, revealing not just papers or contracts, but layers of encryption drives bound reports in a device labeled Air Vigil Console 1.0. Master Node. This is the center, Julian said, voice calm. Every report, every ignored passenger complaint, every time a seat was reassigned under the radar. We've been collecting it for 30 months. Evan raised an eyebrow. You were preparing this long before today. Julian nodded. A system this rotten doesn't crumble in one moment. But if you hit it hard enough, precisely enough, on the right day, in front of the right eyes, it implodes. Isabel was already scanning files into the federal compliance backup drive. FAA wants verified logs by 4 p.m. Media relations is standing down until we confirm what's admissible. Let's show them admissible and undeniable, Julian said. Make it forensic, make it federal. The monitor behind him refreshed, a new alert. DHS inquiry initiated. Discrimination pattern detection systems DPDS engaged. Julian turned. That's our cue. Time to widen the lens. Back at Miami International, word had spread like fire through every concourse. Airport lounges whispered with speculation. Apex staff abandoned terminals mid-shift. Unions called emergency meetings. And outside Gate 17, a crowd had gathered, not angry, not chaotic, just watching. Watching a shift. Watching a name they'd barely known become synonymous with accountability. Julian Carter. The name was now etched across trending pages, financial tickers, breaking banners on TV. But in a small conference room off the Vanguard terminal, a different name appeared, one far less known, but equally important. Marcus Lee, lead architect of the flight disparity model. He was a small man in thick glasses, worn sweater, and a coffee-stained notebook. He approached Julian with visible nervousness. You asked for predictive modeling on digital discrimination metrics. We finished it. It's worse than we thought. He slid a tablet across the table. On it, charts, line graphs, and a colored cluster map pulsed with damning clarity. Black and brown passengers with first-class tickets were 5.4x more likely to be flagged for reassignment in internal Apex software, 6.7x more likely to have their seat malfunction, 11x more likely to experience ID revalidation during pre-boarding. Julian stared at the numbers. This isn't profiling. This is engineering exclusion, he said flatly. Code-level racism. Marcus replied, voice shaking. We built the system to be efficient. Someone else made it discriminatory. Julian turned to Isabel. Can this be traced to user accounts? She didn't hesitate. Already isolating login trails. We'll overlay it with facial recognition matchbacks. The algorithm didn't fail. It followed orders. Julian stood, eyes heavy but locked in. We'll need a public release, not in a press conference. In the open. Let the public interact with the data. Let them see what we see. Evan leaned forward. You want transparency or combustion? I want reform, Julian said. And sometimes the fuse has to be seen to be believed. Across the country at Apex's New York headquarters, executives scrambled. The boardroom was a flurry of strategy memos, legal denials, and cold cups of untouched espresso. Chairman Gregory Holt sat quietly reviewing the incident dossier. He wasn't angry. He was calculating. How many reports did we suppress, he asked his deputy. 37, came the whisper. Maybe more. And how many of them trace back to the same staff, Kristen, Tyler, Diane, and at least 5 more. Gregory's lips thinned. And how did none of you think Julian Carter wouldn't notice the pattern we ignored? Silence. Oing. Then the door opened. A courier entered with a sealed envelope bearing Vanguard's crest. Gregory opened it. Inside, one line handwritten. If power won't act, precision will. Signed, J. Carter. Gregory exhaled, defeated. They don't need us anymore, he murmured. They've already replaced us with facts. Back at the terminal, Julian watched the last file sync upload to the public transparency portal. Within minutes, passengers across the country began receiving alerts. Your Apex flight experience may be part of an active civil audit. Would you like to contribute your story? Thousands clicked yes. By nightfall, over 600 testimonials flooded in. By morning, legislation was already being drafted. And Julian, he sat alone in the same leather chair where his ticket had once been torn apart. But now his silence had become law. It was barely dawn in Washington, D.C., but the halls of the Department of Transportation were already echoing with the sound of urgency. The Apex incident wasn't just trending, it was redefining the national conversation. Overnight, what had started as a cabin confrontation had bloomed into a full-blown policy reckoning. By 6:45 a.m., the Secretary of Transportation had convened a closed-doors summit. At the head of the table, Julian Carter. He wasn't there in a suit. He wasn't there as a headline. He was there as a man holding the receipts. Let's get one thing clear. Julian began placing the Air Vigil tablet at the center of the conference table. I'm not here to demand apologies. I'm here to discuss infrastructure because that's where the disease lives. Across from him, heads of federal agencies nodded stiffly, unsure whether to treat him as an ally or an adversary. Julian tapped the screen. Data sprang to life. Heat maps, user testimonies, redacted staff logs, and then the algorithm trails. 14 major carriers, 9 show pattern deviations against non-white passengers across premium cabins. 7 of those systems use auto-flagging software that mirrors the Apex architecture. He let the words hang. Your systems aren't broken, he said. They're working exactly as someone told them to. A silence fell across the table that felt heavier than law books. Finally, Secretary Marin spoke. What do you want? Julian didn't blink. Federal regulation mandated third-party audits on all airline data logs related to seating upgrades and profiling. And I want Air Vigil implemented as a compliance tool, not optional. Mandatory, someone scoffed down the table. You're proposing a digital TSA for ethics. I'm proposing eyes where there's been willful blindness. And who would fund that? Julian leaned forward. You won't need to. I already did. And it's open source as of 30 minutes ago. Every phone in the room vibrated with a press release. Julian's team had gone live. Air Vigil public dashboard now active. Submit footage. Search incidents. Track outcomes. Julian stood. I've heard the phrase fly the friendly skies for decades, but those skies were only friendly for some. Now they're under review. He didn't wait for approval. He didn't need it. The system had spoken through silence for too long. Now it was time for consequence. By mid-morning, thousands of Apex Air passengers across the country woke to new push notifications. Dear traveler, your recent experience is part of a federal ethics audit. You may be eligible to submit a testimony or receive a formal apology depending on findings. Some ignored it. Most didn't. Airports in Dallas, Chicago, Atlanta, and Los Angeles saw clusters of travelers huddled together showing screenshots, sharing stories. Some were black, others brown, some elderly, a few in military uniforms. All had one thing in common. They remembered a moment when they were made to feel small. Now they realized they weren't alone. Back at Vanguard's headquarters, Julian walked into the central communications suite. Isabel and Evan were already there reviewing responses pouring in from passengers, whistleblowers, and even airline staff. "We've received 11,433 testimonies in under 12 hours, Isabel said, her voice almost trembling. Evan added, and get this over, 300 of them are from airline employees. Anonymous staff. They're uploading training memos, internal chat transcripts. Some of this stuff, it's chilling." Julian looked at the screen. The faces blurred, names redacted, but the stories were raw. "I was told to downgrade an elderly black woman because she didn't match the manifest photo. Our supervisor told us to avoid assigning middle seats in premium rows to Muslim-sounding last names. I flagged the issue once. I got reassigned. That's why I'm submitting this now." Julian breathed in deeply, then out. "We're not stopping at Apex." Evan smirked, a rare moment of satisfaction. "Already ahead of you, American Jet and Atlas Air just requested meetings." "Understood," Julian replied, "but no backroom deals. If they want reform, they do it in the open." Meanwhile, Kristen Walsh sat in a mandatory ethics hearing hosted by Apex's internal HR tribunal. Her once ironclad smirk was gone. She looked smaller than ever, in a chair too big for her. Across the table, a board-appointed moderator clicked play on the overhead screen. First, her own words. "Some people just don't look right for first class." Then her laugh. Then the visible recorded bribe. Kristen swallowed hard. The moderator leaned forward. "This isn't just about your behavior. It's about what your behavior represents. You're not here to defend yourself. You're here to help us understand how this went unchecked for so long." Kristen's hands trembled. No one had ever asked her why before. They'd only asked her how soon she could clock in. But now she realized the damage had always been visible. No one had cared until someone powerful chose not to look away. That night, Julian stood in his office, staring out at the skyline. The lights below flickered like a city trying to blink away its sins. But change wasn't something you blinked into. It was something you architected. One exposure, one testimony, one fired gatekeeper at a time. Evan walked in holding a flash drive. "What is it, Phase 2, Evan said. "Media syndication training, footage, and ethics templates for every airline who signs a compliance letter." Julian took it. "Then tomorrow," he said, "we teach them how to fly right." By the time Julian Carter entered the Apex Air legal headquarters in Manhattan, the building had already transformed into a fortress of panic. On the 32nd floor, executive assistants whispered behind closed glass panels, legal counsels raced between conference rooms, and every printer churned out liability assessments like smoke from a fire no one could contain. But the man they once ignored had arrived with no entourage, no press briefing, and no threats. Just a thumb drive and an appointment with finality. At reception, the desk agent, eyes wide, stood the moment Julian approached. "Mr. Carter," she said nervously, brushing her blazer. "They're expecting you." "Good," he replied simply. He stepped into the private elevator alone. Upstairs, a special executive tribunal was in session. The 5-person board of Apex legal officers sat beneath a corporate crest that suddenly felt ironic, elevating humanity in flight. None of them could meet Julian's eyes when he walked in. He took the seat at the center table and placed the thumb drive on the surface. No preamble. "You asked for a full account of systemic failure," Julian began. "This is it." With a nod from the lead counsel, an assistant plugged the drive into the main display. The screen lit up with a single title card, "Hidden Manifest, 18 Months of Data Discrimination." Julian's voice narrated the first slide. "Using internal log access, Air Vigil has compiled 1,428 confirmed cases of passenger reclassification, manual override seat reassignments, and profile flaggings across 12 Apex Air routes. 72% of those passengers were people of color. 61% were booked in premium cabins. Each stat landed like a punch. The board members shifted in their seats. The screen changed. Security footage showed Kristen Walsh downgrading a Latina doctor traveling with her child. Another clip revealed Tyler Quinn marking a Nigerian diplomat's account with an internal tag labeled "Not Priority Compatible." In one photo, a white crew member laughed while crossing out a black passenger's meal request and writing "Not VIP." This wasn't error, Julian said. It was culture. One board member, a balding man named Whitaker, finally broke the silence. We didn't know it had spread this far. Julian tilted his head. You didn't ask. The screen changed again, this time to audio. Recordings of internal staff meetings filled the room. Laughter slurs delivered behind closed doors. One supervisor saying, "You can spot who's real first class and who's just trying to look like it." I've included full transcripts, source authentication, and timeline validation, Julian added. Every entry is cross-referenced against flight logs and staff schedules. Another board member, Lena Chang, rubbed her temple. This is catastrophic. No, Julian said. What's catastrophic is that your staff believed they'd never be held accountable. That's not a flaw. That's design. Elsewhere in the city, a different kind of meeting was taking place. In a midtown hotel conference room, over 80 corporate leaders from across the transportation and hospitality industries sat in stunned silence as Isabel Gomez and Evan Brooks presented the next phase of Vanguard's reform initiative. The presentation was called Flight Truth Building, a Culture Worth Boarding. Evan explained the AI monitoring protocols. Isabel detailed the ethics audits. Then came the bombshell of voluntary compliance pledge. Every company present was given a choice: sign the commitment to transparency or be listed publicly as non-compliant with ethical travel standards. Some groaned, but none walked out. When a tech CEO asked if this was just a PR stunt, Isabel leaned into the mic. No, this is the first step to prevent your companies from becoming Apex Air. Back in Manhattan, the Apex Tribunal had finished reviewing Julian's evidence. Whitaker cleared his throat. What do you expect from us? Julian said. But not the kind you mail in a press statement. I want reparations. Every passenger downgraded. Every employee retaliated against for reporting. Compensated and formally apologized to. He leaned forward, his voice even. I want the Kristen Walsh of your company banned from airline employment for life. Lena Chang nodded slowly. And Julian added, I want this company to sponsor mandatory ethics training designed by our team for every new hire from the tarmac to the top floor. He paused. You don't get to operate in silence anymore. No one argued. They just wrote it down. An hour later, as Julian left the Apex building, a crowd had gathered. Passengers, activists, media, and former Apex customers stood behind police barricades. Some chanted, others just watched. Julian didn't speak to them. He didn't wave. He simply nodded once and walked into the waiting car. Inside, Evan was already scrolling through updates. Los Angeles Terminal just implemented Air Vigil. Chicago's O'Hare posted a revised anti-bias policy. Atlanta's Aviation Commission just requested your audit framework. Julian looked out the window. We're not fixing a company, he said. We're rebuilding trust in movement itself. And with that, the man they said didn't belong in first class became the architect of a new kind of flight, one that didn't just take people to destinations, it took them forward. The next morning before sunrise touched the skyline of New York. Julian Carter stood alone in the Vanguard headquarters conference room, its glass walls overlooking the city that once shut doors in his face. But this time he wasn't here to prove anything. He was here to finalize the framework of an era. On the table in front of him was a single sheet of paper. At the top, Air Vigil Executive Compliance Mandate, V1.0. Below it, 12 points that would become standard operating procedure for every airline choosing to partner with Vanguard Enterprises from that moment forward. By 6:02 a.m., the first digital signatures arrived. Japan Airlines, Nordic Air, Skynova Brazil. Each one pinged confirmation that they accepted the new code of ethics without hesitation. By 6:07, their first rejection came Apex Air competitor East Sky Travel Group. Their terse reply, "We will continue with our internal review structures as designed." Julian didn't flinch. He didn't need everyone. He just needed the ones who were willing to evolve. Evan entered quietly, a cup of black coffee in hand and a tablet already glowing with alerts. The FAA just issued a formal statement, he said, supporting Vanguard's proposed oversight model. Julian raised an eyebrow. Did they call it an endorsement? Evan smirked. They called it a necessary evolution in airline accountability. That's as close as it gets. Julian nodded. Good. Now let's send the second wave. Hours later, across multiple time zones, airline executives opened their inboxes to find a secure link marked Passenger Dignity Index Live Dashboard Access. The dashboard showed real-time ratings of airline behavior, not flight delays, not seat comfort, but complaints, ethics violations, tampering logs, recorded discrimination patterns, and a transparency score derived from actual employee interactions. Every metric was public, every entry time-stamped and authenticated. No more spin, just signals. No more polished press releases, just facts that couldn't be ignored. By noon, social media had exploded. Passenger Dignity Index trended across platforms. Influencers, whistleblowers, everyday travelers began uploading their own stories, receipts, screenshots, videos. And on every feed, one name kept appearing: Julian Carter, the man who turned quiet humiliation into historic reform. Meanwhile, at JFK's Terminal 4, a small gathering took place in the corner of the departures hall. No cameras, no press, just three men in maintenance uniforms standing beneath a digital flight board. One of them, a weathered worker named Terrence, held his phone up and showed the others a news article. "You see this?" he said. Carter's index flagged Apex's Houston flight for high-risk reclassification. That's the same flight old Ms. Donaldson got downgraded on last month. The others nodded solemnly. "No more hiding," said another. "They gotta be careful now. Cameras are everywhere, and Carter." He made it matter. For once, the people behind the scenes, the invisible backbone of air travel, felt seen too. At 3:00 p.m., Julian walked into a downtown policy forum hosted by the Transportation Justice League. Dozens of industry leaders were in attendance: CEOs, union reps, federal regulators, advocates for disabled travelers, veterans, and immigrant rights. Julian didn't take the stage with fanfare. He stepped to the podium with the same poise he showed on Flight 227. He spoke calmly. "This isn't about one airline," he said. "This is about a pattern, a design built to favor certain faces, certain incomes, certain postures. The rest of us were told to adjust, apologize, and endure." He let the words breathe. "But now we adjust the design." He held up a slim booklet, the Blueprint for Ethical Aviation, and handed it to the moderator. It included Passenger Bill of Rights 2.0, Antique Bias Protocol Integration, Real-Time Reporting APIs, Whistleblower Protection Clauses, Transparent Seat Assignment Logs. The moderator opened it wide-eyed. Julian continued. "If you're building a house that keeps burning down, you don't keep patching it. You change the blueprint." The room erupted in applause. By the end of the week, 3 more major carriers announced partnerships with Vanguard's Air Vigil system. Julian's team launched the Witness Line, a protected channel for staff across the aviation industry to report discrimination anonymously. Within 48 hours, over 3,000 submissions came in. And in each message, a variation of the same phrase appeared: "I never thought anyone would listen." Julian read every one. Not because he had to, but because he understood what it felt like to be erased by indifference. Back in his office, Julian placed his old boarding pass from Flight 227 inside a glass frame. It was still torn, still creased, still the catalyst. Below it, he inscribed a single line: "Dignity doesn't need a seat assignment." He hung it on the wall beside Vanguard's first charter certificate. Because for all the high-rises, jet engines, and streaming headlines, this moment of personal reclamation meant more. He sat down, opened his laptop, and began drafting the next phase. Not of vengeance, but of vision. Across the aviation world, the aftershocks of Julian Carter's quiet revolution rippled like an invisible jet stream. At terminals in Singapore, Dubai, Munich, and Sao Paulo, screens lit up with an unfamiliar but now standard message. This airline complies with Vanguard dignity protocols. Passenger index green. Travelers paused. Some squinted at the fine print. Others pulled out their phones to check what it meant. Within hours, public trust graphs began circulating. Airlines who opted in saw a spike in customer bookings. Those who declined were marked yellow or worse, red. One viral tweet summed it up: "I don't care about snacks or legroom anymore. I just want to fly with dignity." In a quiet corner of Newark International, a black couple in their 60s clutched their printed boarding passes for Flight 611. The husband, Mr. Grayson, looked at the monitor, then at his wife. "Look," he said, pointing. "They've got the green index." She smiled, tension easing from her shoulders. For the first time in years, boarding a plane didn't feel like preparing for a courtroom. Back in the Vanguard offices, the atmosphere shifted from one of retaliation to regeneration. Julian didn't allow celebration. There were no champagne corks, no media interviews, no internal memos dripping with self-congratulation. Instead, he called for audits. "Check our own systems," he told Isabel. "If we expect others to uphold it, we hold it tighter." Evan organized review panels that included people from all backgrounds: frequent flyers, single mothers, disabled veterans, cabin staff, junior engineers. He brought them into boardrooms where their voices had never been welcomed before. "Tell us what doesn't work," he said. "No script, no spin." And they did. A former TSA agent detailed how profiling shaped screening cues. A bilingual call center worker described how accent bias impacted complaint resolutions. A retired flight attendant broke down how visual assumptions led to upgraded passengers being quietly downgraded on overbooked flights. Julian listened. And with every insight, he refined the system, not just the tech, but the thinking behind it. Technology doesn't erase bias, he told his developers. It just measures the size of the wall so we know how to tear it down. Meanwhile, Apex Air's leadership scrambled to keep pace. Their competitor had become their conscience. Interim CEO Angela Moreno, a Latina aviation veteran with no patience for performative change, took over after the previous board was dissolved. On her first day, she addressed every employee, baggage handlers, to executives via livestream. "I will not lead a company built on silence," she declared. "If you ever ask someone where they're really from, denied a seat because of a hunch, or ignored someone because their voice didn't sound corporate, this message is for you." That era ends now. Within 72 hours, Apex signed on to Vanguard's compliance charter. Not out of pressure, but out of necessity, because passengers were no longer passive. They were watching, recording, reporting, and the market was listening. In an elementary school classroom in Detroit, a fourth-grade teacher named Ms. Holloway paused a reading lesson to show her students a news clip. On screen, Julian Carter, seated in a plane cabin, quiet, composed, dismantling an empire with strategy, not shouting. She turned to her students. "Why do you think he didn't yell?" A little girl raised her hand. "Because when you have power, you don't have to," another said. "Because yelling would have made them ignore him." Ms. Holloway smiled. "Exactly. Power doesn't always look loud." She wrote on the board, "Respect doesn't shout, it stands." Across classrooms, lecture halls, and Sunday sermons, Julian's name was no longer just trending, it was teaching. In the shadows, Diane Heller watched it all unfold from her estate in Aspen. Her name, once synonymous with prestige, was now tethered to corporate misconduct. Her consulting firm lost 3 key accounts. Her private investor club revoked her speaking invitations. Still, she didn't disappear. She studied the reports, followed Vanguard's expansion, observed Julian's moves, and then surprisingly sent an email. Subject proposal to Julian Carter from Diane Healer. Mr. Carter, you once told me accountability wasn't vengeance. I didn't understand it then. I do now. If you ever consider building a global advisory council, I'd like to offer my insights not to excuse the past, but to help ensure it's never repeated. If not for me, perhaps for others who still live in the blind spots I refuse to see. Regards Diane. Julian read it. He didn't respond, but he archived it not to dismiss it, but to remember. Even enemies can become instruments of change if they're willing. That night, Julian returned home to find a handwritten envelope on his doorstep. No name, just a sticker that read Row 3A. Inside was a folded photo, him mid-flight, seated calmly while chaos churned around him. On the back, I sat behind you. I wanted to speak up. I didn't, but I'll never stay quiet again. He placed it beside his glass-frame boarding pass, then turned out the lights. The revolution didn't need noise anymore. It just needed more people willing to act in silence. In the following weeks, the airline industry experienced something it hadn't seen in decades: public accountability that couldn't be delayed, denied, or downplayed. Airports across the country scrambled to update their systems, not for efficiency, but for equity. At San Francisco International, a security officer paused when a black teenager in a hoodie approached the TSA checkpoint. He was about to waive for additional screening, a pattern drilled into him subconsciously. But then he noticed the small blue badge clipped to the boy's backpack, Air Vigil Verified. The officer's hand stopped. He smiled instead. "You're good. Have a safe flight." It was a small moment, but it wasn't lost on anyone. Julian Carter's Air Vigil didn't just track data. It trained behavior, one subconscious act at a time. Airlines who opted in saw their employee behavioral data audited quarterly. Every recorded incident generated a heat map showing not only where injustice occurred, but who was responsible and how often. The industry didn't welcome it, but the market demanded it. Investors wanted accountability, flyers wanted dignity, and Julian wasn't asking. He was coding it into the infrastructure. Meanwhile, on the top floor of Apex Air's new crisis center, Angela Moreno reviewed the latest stakeholder briefings. Gone were the luxury boardroom lunches. In their place were weekly debriefs on inclusion metrics, frontline incident ratios, and internal re-education completions. At the center of it all stood a wall of silent photographs. Real passengers, people who had filed complaints over the past 5 years, most ignored. Now their stories lined the corridor, faces of pain, of patience, of quiet strength. Angela ran a hand across one, a woman in her 50s who had been denied re-entry to her seat because she didn't look first class. Another, a man forced to explain his PhD credentials to a gate agent who thought he'd accidentally upgraded. They weren't statistics anymore. They were witnesses. Angela turned to her deputy. "Has Carter responded to our reinstatement request?" The deputy hesitated. "Not yet." Angela nodded. "He will, but not until we earn it." Across the country, a different kind of tension simmered, less visible, but just as loud. In corporate lounges and corner offices, executives whispered about Julian, about the precedent he'd set. Some saw inspiration, others saw threat, because if a quiet man in 2A could take down an airline in 10 minutes, what could others do? In one such boardroom in Chicago, a white-haired CEO paced behind smoked glass. "He weaponized silence," the man muttered. "No," corrected a younger executive. "He reclaimed it." The room fell still. That distinction mattered. Back at Vanguard headquarters, Evan and Isabel sat in the newly created Department of Cultural Infrastructure, finalizing the onboarding of 3 more airlines to the Air Vigil protocol. "The system's holding," Evan said. "No breaches, no exploitation so far." Isabel nodded. "That's because it wasn't built to control. It was built to remember." At her desk was a small brass plaque Julian had left her without ceremony. "Memory is a form of justice." She kept it beside her screen. because she never wanted to forget the moment when the system blinked and the silence inside Flight 227 became louder than any outcry ever could. Julian, meanwhile, had turned his attention to the less visible battle long-term reform. He wasn't chasing headlines. He was rewriting policies. Industry roundtables were now offering him the moderator's seat, but he declined most. He didn't want to speak on panels. He wanted to rebuild panels entirely. He met with union reps, cabin staff, tech security architects, and civil rights lawyers. His goal wasn't just awareness, it was architecture. Change that doesn't get codified, he told his team, gets forgotten. At one internal session, a young intern nervously raised her hand. "Sir," she asked, "when did you know it was time to act on that flight?" Julian paused. "I didn't," he said. The room hushed. "I didn't know, I decided." That's the difference. One evening as he exited the Vanguard building, Julian saw a janitor sweeping near the revolving doors. A young man no older than 22, earbuds in, mouthing lyrics to himself. Julian paused. He remembered what silence could cost. "Excuse me," he said. The janitor pulled out one bud. "Sir, what's your name, Luis? You want to do this forever?" Luis blinked. "No disrespect, but it pays the bills." Julian nodded. "You ever dream bigger?" Luis shrugged. "Who has time to dream?" Julian pulled out a card. On it was a QR code and the words, "Voice Inside Fellowship Vanguard." "Apply," Julian said. "This building needs fewer walls. People like you are the ones who tear them down." He walked away before Luis could answer. But Luis stood there long after he left, staring at the card, wondering if this was what a door opening felt like. And somewhere in a small cabin near Asheville, North Carolina, a retired flight attendant named Claire, once dismissed for filing a complaint about discrimination, watched the headlines unfold. She raised her wine glass to no one in particular. "To the quiet ones," she said, and toasted the storm Julian Carter had started not with thunder, but with a whisper. Julian Carter didn't want monuments. He wanted mechanisms. By the time the second week passed, Apex Air's operational infrastructure had been overhauled from the inside out. Terminal lounges, once lined with vague customer service platitudes, were now adorned with new signage. "Bias is not subjective. It's systemic. We hold the system accountable, not the passenger." He hadn't penned that line. Isabel had. It hung in 6 international airports by the end of the month. What Julian had done wasn't just reclaim justice. He had engineered a framework for it to repeat itself even in his absence. At a quiet summit in Brussels, 13 global airline executives met behind closed doors, reviewing Vanguard's new protocol. No press, no media, just industry leaders forced to reckon with what they could no longer ignore. An Ethiopian CEO, Amari Desta, looked up from the slides. "He built a virus scanner for bias," she said, "but one that doesn't just detect. It isolates and disables." No one disagreed. It wasn't a tool, it was a warning shot. Back in the Vanguard building's sub-level analytics suite, rows of screens displayed anonymized heat maps of passenger treatment. Red zones flashed where interventions had occurred, gate denials, seat downgrades, language-based targeting. Green zones glowed where employees had interrupted the cycle, offering help, acknowledging missteps, correcting records. Julian stood behind the lead monitor, arms crossed. "How long to get real-time training prompts into the interface?" he asked. Evan replied without hesitation. "We've coded them, just need final review." Julian nodded. "Push it. Make correction immediate, not after the damage." Nearby, a young engineer whispered to another, "He's not even angry." "No," came the reply. "He's surgical." Meanwhile, Kristen Walsh sat alone in her studio apartment just outside of Tampa. The walls were bare, her suitcase still open from the day she'd been escorted off the plane. She hadn't unpacked. Her name now existed in hashtags she never imagined. Walsh effect. System cracked, passenger 0. She turned on the TV only to mute it again. Every headline reminded her of who she had been in that cabin, her smirk, her silence the moment she ripped a boarding pass she never had the right to question. The hardest part wasn't the backlash, it was the mirror. Across town, Tyler Quinn sat at his father's kitchen table, staring at his revoked technician license. The FAA had issued a public notice, manipulation of flight records by employee Tyler Quinn, subject to federal review. For all the keyboard shortcuts he'd memorized, he couldn't hack his way out of this one. Dad, he finally said, do you think I'm racist? His father looked up, then looked away. I think you never asked until you got caught. In a law firm conference room downtown, Diane Heller listened to her lawyers explain the scope of her legal exposure. Her fortune couldn't insulate her from ethics violations. And this time there was no hush fund. The Apex board had frozen all investor reimbursements pending formal hearings. Diane sat back, her pearl bracelet jingling faintly. How did one man do this? She asked. The attorney closed the folder. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He just recorded. And in the homes of millions across America, people like Julian, people overlooked, erased, minimized, watched the reruns of the incident on news specials. A retired black teacher in Atlanta wiped tears from her eyes as she watched the footage of Julian sitting still in 2A while chaos unfolded around him. That's how we've always done it, she whispered to her granddaughter beside her with grace, but not silence. The granddaughter, no older than 12, leaned in. Does that mean I can sit anywhere I want? The woman smiled. Now, yes. And they'll remember why. Julian didn't need praise. He needed policy. And that meant finalizing the integration of Flight Truth, the mobile reporting app designed to let passengers anonymously submit incidents in real time, whether they were refused a seat upgrade, overheard a comment in a jet bridge, or saw bias unfold beside them. No more waiting for a media storm. Now the system itself could be forced to respond. When the app launched, it surged to 2 million downloads in the first 48 hours. But Julian didn't stop there. He commissioned the design of Equicast, a training engine powered by AI and human review capable of identifying microaggressions in staff interactions. It could parse tone, body language, and phrasing, flagging patterns before they metastasized into scandals. He sent it to Apex and 20 other carriers. Some rejected it. Others quietly installed it before the week was out. The blueprint was being followed even if reluctantly. One evening, Julian returned to the airport where it all began, Miami International. He didn't announce himself. He boarded a red-eye flight to Denver alone, carrying only a leather briefcase and a quiet presence. At the gate, a young attendant glanced at his name, blinked twice, and smiled faintly. Welcome aboard, Mr. Carter. He nodded. No drama, no disturbance, just the ripple of a world adjusting itself. As he took his seat in 2A, a flight attendant approached with a glass of water, placed it on his tray with both hands, and added softly, "Thank you for changing how we serve." He didn't reply. He just looked out the window. The sky was clear. The system for once had no turbulence. At 36,000 feet, Julian Carter sat in the glow of the cabin light, his reflection mirrored faintly on the window beside seat 2A. The world outside was velvet black, broken only by the scattered lights of cities passing far below. He didn't hear the engine hum. What pulsed louder was the echo of what had unfolded not just on that plane, but across the entire structure that thought it could shrink a man into silence. In his hands rested a single document, not a press release, not a legal summary. It was a letter handwritten, unsealed, addressed to the Board of Governors of the FAA. Subject: a proposal for reform from the inside. He had drafted it not in rage, but with the composure of someone who had studied every inch of a system and found its pressure points. The kind you press not to destroy, but to reset. Across the aisle, a woman from an indigenous nonprofit he had once funded leaned forward and said quietly, "What you did, how you did it. It gave us more than a headline. It gave us permission." Julian turned, offered a nod. Permission is too rare. We all need precedent. And precedent was now the atmosphere he walked in. The next day, while most companies were chasing press cycles, Vanguard was publishing frameworks. Julian's legal team, led by Isabel Gomez and supported by transparency advocate Noah Reed, issued the Vanguard Accord, a first-of-its-kind ethics agreement for service industries. It wasn't required by law, but in less than 72 hours, over 40 companies voluntarily signed it. Not out of fear, out of necessity. It required every organization that transported, housed, served, or registered people to audit bias in real time. It enforced digital trail accountability, front-facing policy visibility, and employee protection clauses for whistleblowers. No more isolated incidents. No more blaming algorithms. Denial for the first time would have a paper trail. And denial's cousin Silence was being evicted from the boardroom. At Apex Air's headquarters in Atlanta, the new internal audit team moved fast. The entire HR division had been placed on hold, and every outstanding employee complaint flagged in the previous 18 months was being reopened. What had once been a paper-passing ritual had turned into an actual tribunal. Employees who had once feared reprisal now came forward in waves. A Dominican baggage handler stepped up about ethnic slurs on locker doors. A Middle Eastern pilot recalled being passed over for international routes for cultural optics. Even an elderly white mechanic submitted a report saying, "If it takes one man in seat 2A to finally clean this rot, then I'm with him." The reckoning was no longer limited to race. It extended to dignity. In that same wave, other airlines began issuing preemptive apology statements that used Julian's name without ever naming him. One CEO wrote, "Recent events have reminded us of the silent hierarchies embedded in our systems. We cannot claim to serve the world while degrading those who look like it." His communications team didn't write that line. His daughter, a journalism student, did. She had watched the viral footage and asked him one question: would you have let him sit in 2A? The silence that followed cracked open the truth. In the press, think pieces exploded. Julian Carter and the Quiet Revolution, the day the cabin became the courtroom. But Julian declined all interviews. He instructed his assistant to reply to every media inquiry with a single line: power isn't in the retelling, it's in the rewriting. Instead, he stayed focused on implementation. He personally oversaw the installation of Air Vigil at regional airports, piloting in Detroit, Oakland, and Birmingham first. Not just because they needed oversight, but because historically they'd been excluded from being a part of reform. He met with maintenance crews, gate agents, even janitorial staff. At every stop, he asked the same question: what would have helped you speak up sooner? The answers filled a 134-page report that would become the next foundation of his reform architecture, every voice manual. It was sent to every executive in Vanguard's network. No signatures, no PR campaign. Just the weight of knowing that silence was now being watched. Back in Miami, the same gate where Kristen Walsh had torn that ticket had been renamed. Gate 32B was now called the Carter Concourse. No announcement. No ribbon cutting, just a small metal plaque that read, "Integrity doesn't need a microphone. It just needs a seat." Travelers paused when they saw it. Some took selfies, others stood in quiet reflection. A woman in a flight crew uniform touched it lightly, whispered, "I remember the day this changed." Julian never walked through that terminal again. He didn't need to. His absence there spoke as loudly as his presence ever could. He had left behind more than just a memory. He had left behind a protocol, a standard, a new floor for dignity to stand on. And as the clouds passed under another Vanguard chartered flight, somewhere high above a map full of unresolved stories, Julian Carter sat reviewing notes, not for how to punish the system, but how to teach it to never forget. Julian Carter stood beneath the rotunda of Vanguard's headquarters just as the morning sun lit the glass canopy in gold. The sky was quiet. No headlines, no flashbulbs, no shouts. But within those silent rays, a legacy was taking root. He wasn't the man they expected to change aviation. He was the man they tried to dismiss quietly. That made all the difference. Inside his team was finalizing the last module of the Flight Equity Index, a tool designed to analyze, score, and hold airlines accountable across over 200 bias indicators. Each data point, each algorithm had been tested, not just in labs, but in the real world, where apologies cost nothing and dignity is too often a rounding error. The platform would launch globally at midnight. But before that, Julian had one final appointment. He entered the small media hall named the Atwater Room after another silent warrior, a woman who once mopped floors while fluent in 9 languages. At the front sat a small audience of interns, young leaders, and legacy staff. Not a media crew in sight, just people willing to listen. Julian stepped to the podium and looked at the crowd not like a CEO, but like a witness. When someone tears your boarding pass, he began softly, they're not just shredding paper. They're trying to strip away proof that you belong. He paused. They do it hoping you'll get up and walk away. He held up a replica of his torn ticket from that day. I kept this, he said, not to remember the insult, but to remember the decision I made to sit anyway. Silence filled the room. Systems don't crumble because you yell, he continued. They crumble because you document, because you respond in ways that force the world to adjust its posture. He turned toward the wall where the flight path from that infamous route Miami to New York was etched in brushed steel. They told me I didn't belong in first class, and maybe that was true in their system. But the thing about systems is they're built, which means they can be rebuilt. One intern raised her hand. How did you stay so calm? Julian smiled. Because rage is loud, but strategy moves the ground beneath them. Another asked, what do you want us to remember most? Julian looked down for a long moment, then said, that seat wasn't just a place to sit. It became a pulpit, a witness stand, a launch pad. He stepped away from the podium and handed each of the attendees a small black envelope. Inside was a card that read, you always belong, even when they pretend you don't. Back in his office, Julian watched the sun climb higher. The world hadn't just watched an airline get grounded. It watched a new standard take flight. Since that day, Apex Air's CEO had resigned. Kristen Walsh's case became mandatory study in federal airline ethics training. The Department of Transportation launched Passenger Bill 2.0, modeled on the Vanguard reforms. And more than 11,000 passengers across the country had used the new reporting platform to safely speak up. But none of that mattered if the picture stayed unchanged. That's why Julian's next step wasn't corporate, it was human. He funded the Carter Initiative for Dignity and Service, a program that trained frontline workers in empathy, ethics, and conflict de-escalation, while offering scholarships to janitors, baggage handlers, and hospitality staff who wanted to pursue careers in diplomacy, law, or aviation leadership. He believed systems could change from the top, but he knew culture changed from the ground. And as his private email pinged with a single new message, he opened it slowly. It was from a young gate agent in St. Louis. The subject line read, I didn't tear the ticket. Inside the message, today, a black grandmother approached with a first-class boarding pass. For a second, I saw what Kristen must have seen that day, and I paused. But then I remembered what you said. I scanned it. I smiled, and I said, welcome aboard, Ms. Lee. Thank you for changing the script. Julian sat back in his chair. He didn't reply immediately. He just let the message sit there glowing on the screen. Proof that the system had blinked. That change had landed. Outside, another plane ascended into the sky. Inside, a man who never raised his voice had just rewritten an entire industry's moral code. All from seat 2A. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to catch more gripping stories like this. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.